Crazy Stupid Podcast.
If this is your first time watching, we'd love it if you could hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell so that you are aware of when we post things.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Crazy Stupid Podcast. Today, we're going to do a recap of all of season 2 of JJK now that we have seen it in its entirety, and then we went back and we rewatched it so we could kind of think about it as one project instead of like a week-to-week thing.
I feel like I'm still on a high from that Bills game.
Oh, did you guys win?
We did, but
It sounded intense.
The score was 31-17. So like in retrospect, like maybe it wasn't that close, but there were key moments where it could have gotten close.
Who did you guys play?
The Steelers.
Okay.
If this was like the Dolphins or the Jets or the Patriots, I would have been talking like hella shit. I got too much respect for the Steelers, for Mike Tomlin, black head coach, like probably the most successful black head coach and one of the most successful coaches in general in terms of like winning. He's never had a losing season.
Wow.
Since he's
we love black excellence.
Yeah. Do you want to start? You can sort of go first, and then I can try to gather my thoughts.
So of course, season 2 starts off with a hidden inventory arc, which I just want to cut in real quick. I've been looking at our comment section, and a lot of comments are from people being like they feel like the writing in JJK is like all over the place. On rewatching, I just don't really understand that. Like I saw so many moments of like I understand why they placed this here now that I've seen it. So I just don't really understand when people say that. But obviously start with the hidden inventory arc. Like still my favorite arc. I don't know if it'll ever be topped personally. I mean, maybe I don't know what's coming, but from what I've seen so far, I like hidden inventory the most. I think because it's where we get the most. I see you should have put him in the room.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's where we get the most intimate look at people's relationships.
Right.
One of the things I noticed right off the bat was that at the beginning of the season, I feel like Geto is more human and more connected to humanity than Gojo is. I mean, Geto's the one that says, that the success of a society is determined by the survival of its weakest. He's also the one who seems to take the goal of jujitsu really seriously in terms of like why it's important and why we have rules and all these things. And for him, at the beginning of the season, it's pretty clear that he views it as a tool for protecting weaker people from curses, protecting humanity from curses. Whereas Gojo, you can kind of see he thinks of it more as like a game. And because he is really strong, even before he masters the full potential of his technique, he's super strong still, and so you can see how that sort of distances him from like the risks and of jujitsu and curses and what makes it so important, and it kind of gives him like this naivete that I think distances him from humanity in a way that Geto does not. Like Gojo sees things as like a test of strength, an opportunity to show how strong he is. It's kind of like a game. When he does master everything, he goes back to fight Toji. And the thing that he says is he says, I'm not even angry right now. Like everything is just so beautiful. When he's at his strongest, it's like he goes into this like state of nirvana, which is basically like the severing yourself from human emotion. While his technique sort of makes him further and further from humanity, Geto's requires him to be closer and closer and more intimate with it, and more intimate with its ugliest parts, because he literally has to ingest the result of humanity's pain and suffering and anger and all those things.
After rewatching it and hearing what you're saying, I definitely agree with a lot of those points. Initially, I thought the hidden inventory was like the moment that was sort of like a pivot for Gojo, but I still don't know if he has had a full paradigm shift with the way that he interacts with certain things. Like, for example, when Yuji asked him about battling Sukuna, he was like, nah, I'd win, I'm the strongest. Gojo calls Jogo weak in season 1 in comparison to Sukuna that says you're strong. The element of that perspective, I still think sort of lingers for Gojo a little bit, which makes me very interested on the possibilities of where his character can go from here, because that would be an interesting thing to see sort of explored on what does it look like for a character that is so strong to go through a transformation where even with all that strength, like he's realizing I'm not infallible.
I mean, you would think that him getting put inside the prison realm would be a humbling moment, but it was unclear if it was based on like the little glimpse that we caught.
Right.
He was
it still was like,
what did he said? Everything will work out.
Right.
I'm like, well, I don't know. I hope so. I don't know at this. I mean, honestly, no, it didn't. Already we've lost too much.
No,
so
it didn't work out.
I feel like the hidden inventory arc, the first arc in season 2, is very much focused on one's sense of humanity and how connected to it you are. Because even with Riko-chan, she goes through that whole thing where she talks about how basically she was raised to sort of distance herself from humanity and the human experience,
right? Because
she knew in the end that she was going to end up being like absorbed or erased into Tengen.
Mm-hmm.
And so she talks about how she had to like avoid adventurous things or dangerous things so she could keep herself safe. She talks about how she doesn't really remember when her parents died and how she doesn't really even feel like pain or loss from that day, and how she kind of thought that like all of this would make it easier for her when it was time for her to become like one with Tengen or whatever. Like she basically just gave up on living a full life for the sake of what her destiny was, what she was supposed to become. And when she's finally given a choice, the first time she's ever been given a choice, she realizes that she wants those things, that she wants to be more connected to humanity. And it's Geto that gives her that choice, not Gojo, notably. Which, I mean, Gojo would have, they obviously had the conversation, but I think that it was intentional to put Geto there in that moment, being the one to tell her that, because it's, I mean, it kind of shows where he was at that point in his development as a character and how he was viewing the importance of being a human and living a human life and having a chance to have all of these experiences. Yeah.
And I mean, she only spent with them a few days, but it sort of gave her a glimpse at like, this is what I could essentially have and or miss out on if I were to make this other choice. I wanted to jump back to something that you said earlier that I think was a really good point about things sort of feeling sort of disjointed in a way with the storytelling. I think there's two things. I know we've talked about this before, but I do think on the one hand, I felt like things felt more seamless on the rewatch, but I partly only think that because I didn't have to wait on weekly releases. I know we've talked about this before, but I do think streaming has sort of harmed the way we consume television now. I'm trying to think about how I can carefully word this, because I think when there are any unanswered questions, any cliffhangers, any sort of Easter eggs that haven't sort of been answered yet, any form of storytelling that requires you to remember things that may not have a payoff for maybe like 5 or 6 episodes later down the road, that gets turned into like a critique of the show in terms of the quality of the writing. And I don't think that that's fair, because I remember that happening similarly in Obi-Wan. I know people have mixed feelings about the show, but there was one particular moment with one of the characters where you thought that, wait, if this character were to be unalive, that would mess up the canon for what happens later on, because there's Obi-Wan is a bit of a prequel to what sort of happens later on, right? I don't want to start naming characters just for anybody that may want to watch it later on down the road, but all the while it got to the point where one of the actor who portrayed that character went on late night, and it got asked as a question where he was like, listen, essentially, I'm paraphrasing it, but the point he's trying to make across is like, listen, we respect the canon of the originals and the sequels, and that went into the writing. Like, he didn't want to go out and say like, guys, I'm not dead, duh. But like, he's trying to find a way to sort of calm everyone down. But there was a sense of panic of like, wait a minute, if we're not able to take risks in a weekly release, then that means that like we're not able to get some of the best form of writing, because rewatching it, there is a lot of payoff that you get, a lot of first full circle moments in this season 2 that landed so much better, as you said, now that I had this rewatch, seeing the seeds that were being planted from very early on. And I know that I've mentioned that like there are moments where like JJK can slow down, but I do think that is sort of contingent on, one, because they're not able to stream things. I think there is a fear from a lot of companies, if we don't have just like a little bit of like a media dopamine to like keep everyone going, they won't tune in. Like, it's hard to bring in a new IP to you know, the era that we're living in right now for people to want to be interested in something new. And two, I think a lot of our mutuals sort of mentioned this, the manga almost got canceled. So they were almost on like their tippy toes for a while of like, we have to write things in a certain way that will sort of keep people interested. And maybe that sort of resulted in less slow burn that I think some of us can sometimes appreciate, because it gives more breadth into a lot of these characters. So I do think there are a lot of factors that probably played into what people are feeling. And I think those feelings are valid. But I do think some of that is on us in how we're wanting to start consuming media. We had this talk earlier on with the Kenjaku reveal of the brain being inside Geto's body. I saw a lot of people sort of questioning the sort of validity in that decision because of how it might impact Geto's sort of antagonist approach on the show. And I can sort of understand why. Like, I saw a lot of people use the word cop out. A lot of people use that it hurts the story. It weakens Geto as the antagonist. They should have just stuck with him. And I think at first I sort of agreed with it. But after this second watch, I kind of understand why, at least in my opinion, one of the reasons why I think that decision was made. I think it really ties into one of the reasons. I think there's a plethora of reasons, but the reason that I think sort of stands out is they consistently sort of use this theme of like, what does the body and the soul sort of mean throughout the show? And I just want to make sure that like I get all of my thoughts down. So I try to make that point. So that reoccurring theme of the body and the soul, that sort of comes up on multiple occasions, right? Obviously, and in one of the examples, Mato has that convo with Nanami in season 1, where he sort of poses the question as like the chicken or the egg, like which one sort of comes first. And then you have these two characters, particularly in the hidden inventory arc, where the show makes it very clear that these two are almost like soul tied together with Gojo and Geto, and the way of how they're closely connected, how they interact with each other, the way that their story arcs sort of pivot after the hidden inventory arc, and even in JJK 0, like Gojo uses that language like my one and only, which that could mean a lot of different things. I digress on that. But the point is, if they wanted to make the point of what the soul and the body sort of represent, they ground the concept by forming it and framing it around two people that you are going to learn to care about, which is why the hidden inventory arc is so personal. I don't think you can really hone in on the metaphor of the soul and the body if you don't make it personal about two people and their souls, and in this case, a body that was taken from an individual. Because you sort of see a couple of things that show up in the hidden inventory arc, even in the theme song itself, like these two Siamese fighting fishes that happen in the intro. One of them obviously represents Gojo, the other represents Geto in the way that they're sort of presented. The water gets dirtier around Gojo's side, and that changes how both of them look in that moment. And so they're really trying to get this point across of like Geto's soul is changed by the corruption that happens in JJK and the systems that are at play with how they sort of use sorcerers and not really getting to root issues. And that creates a sense of nihilism for him, right? His soul is essentially changed by what happened. I got this quote from like someone's Reddit post where they made this point of like the concept of the soul in Jujutsu Kaisen is closely tied to themes of life, death, and human condition. They actually compare the soul and the body to a source code and a console. These two things where doing something within a software will undeniably alter the code in some way or another. And that's sort of precisely what we see here with these two people. And so that sort of drives the point home of like how they're sort of connected, these two things. You have your soul and your body. But I think on a more personal level, if you wanted to understand the impact of how the soul or how someone's soul can sort of continue to exist even after they're gone, you get the Kenjaku reveal. Because when Gojo sees him, he sees the body, but his soul is telling him that's not Geto. After life has passed for Geto, he sort of hears that sort of command by Gojo, and then he responds to this body that's being controlled by a curse, even though his soul technically isn't really there. At least that's what we're supposed to be taught until he reacts that way. I think I really enjoyed how the soul is still responding to something even
after it's gone.
Yeah. The impact that you have on someone's soul, it sort of transcends death in a bit. And I actually think that's a very beautiful way of getting that point across, where I don't know if that could, if it would land for me. I can only speak for myself. If it only stayed in like the philosophical sort of mumbo jumbo, a lot of dialogue, a lot of dense sort of talking.
They have to display it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the way that they displayed it with Geto and in that specific moment, I think it really landed for me.
What happened with Rico, he could have very easily, and in my opinion would have made more, personally for me this would have made more sense, but he could have very easily blamed Jujutsu Society for everything that happened and turned on them instead of turning on curses. Because when you think about it, curses had nothing to do with what happened. Everything that happened had nothing to do with them. And even the person who defeated Geto and initially Gojo too was a human that had no cursed energy. When we first started watching it, and I think when we watched it, we stopped after the episode with Rico and then we started it again. And one of the questions I wrote down was like, why does witnessing all of that cause Geto to turn against humanity and curses? When in that situation, like, it was a human who was the victim of everything that happened, and she was the human of Jujutsu Society. She wasn't the victim of humans or curses. And when I watch it, I honestly feel like what happened had more to do with his loneliness after the fact and less to do with what actually happened with Rico. I think after everything that went down, when Gojo becomes extremely powerful and he's off doing his own thing, and we see Geto's like extremely lonely and he's kind of stuck in his own head and trying to process everything that happened and everything that he has to do all the time. Yeah. And I feel like it's very similar to what we see happen when we see like young men get pulled into these like hate groups. I think it's very similar to like, you are in a state where you feel very lonely and powerless, and you have two options. You can either turn your attention to the institutions and the systems that are actually the cause of the things that are hurting you, but that's more difficult and more daunting and requires community. Or you turn against people who are less powerful than you so that you feel more powerful. And I think that's what happened with Geto. I think he was lonely after what happened, and he felt powerless because he was in this cycle with everything that he was having to do, ingesting all of these curses. He didn't really have anybody to turn to or to talk to about it. And instead of turning on Jujutsu Society and being like, this is the problem and this is what I need to take down, he did the opposite. And he started turning on the people who he could more easily overpower. Yeah. Because the thing that always comes up over and over again in the show is this idea of like strong protecting the weak in various forms. Like you have Yuji's grandfather who says like, you are strong, so you have to protect other people. Yeah. You have the way that Gojo and Nanami are always trying to protect younger people. In Hidden Inventory arc, Gojo's the one who keeps saying we're the strongest, but then Geto repeats that when he's talking to Rico about how they're going to protect her so that she can make her own choice. Yeah. And so it comes up a lot. And then the people who we are supposed to look at as villains are always people who violate that. Yeah. People who use their strength to dominate over or to harm people who are weaker than them. Geto, when he turns, what he turns away from is his own moral stance of protecting the weak. He essentially abandons that and says, why should I be protecting people less powerful than me? Yeah. Like he starts to question the value of that. I mean, we also have Mei and the way that what happens with her and her brother, her little brother. Even the scene when Yuji kills Mahito, the imagery. Yeah, the imagery of a wolf hunting down rabbits is essentially like the same idea of like strong hunting down the weak. Yeah. And so I feel like they keep using the term weak, and I think like in this society, like that makes sense because like you were saying, they have like a very clear tier system of strength. Like you can very clearly define who is physically stronger than other people. But I think a better allegory is for for our real world is like marginalized. The success of a society is the protection of its most marginalized people, the people most at risk of being forgotten and left behind. And when a society abandons that moral duty to protect people who are at risk, who are marginalized, that's when you see society crumble and its morality is gone. And we're consistently in a fight to make sure that doesn't happen. And I feel like talking about, like you use the word like supremacy, that's very clearly to me the point that JJK is trying to push.
Yeah. They do a really good job at sort of explaining the various reactionary measures that marginalized people or people who were harmed by systems, how they react to what takes place to them, what happens to them. So I think there's a couple of things. There is no real effort to rectify the culture or the systems that created the problems from the get-go. If they were to really solve the issue of removing curses or allowing humans to be able to control their curse energies, that would crumble the hierarchies that they sort of created. Clans would be insignificant, the higher ups would be insignificant, and the power that they have over so many people, so many sorcerers, even the Japanese government would crumble. So they would never even consider that response. But what happens as a way to sort of shift the conversation is they place all of the blames on the victims of the people of that system. All of the conversation is centered around what Geto did and not about why Geto did what he did. It's an important question to ask when it comes to a very radical response to being harmed or a radical response to a sense of injustice from people that are consistently harmed by systems. And I think that this idea of like institutions narrowing the scope of the conversation to only look at a harmed person's flaws, I think is a very like intentional tactic, right? You are blaming the victim in a sense because of the immoral thing that they did and not expanding the scope of, wait a minute, there is a lot happening here that we're trying to sort of keep in an insular way. And I think that that's a very common tactic that you see a lot of government entities and people in power use across the board.
I loved the placement of the episode right after Hidden Inventory, right after we finished Hidden Inventory.
Oh, we get to the three. Yes.
And it starts the Shibuya arc, but like we are not there yet. It's like a little intermission kind of. I thought the placement was so good because you're drawing a direct correlation between Yuji, Megami, and Nobara and Geto, Gojo, and Shoko. Because you, like, all it is, it's just an episode of them being kids and being friends. The whole thing with the girl from high school that had a crush on Yuji, and Nobara's like, I can do this. I can play matchmaker. Even Megami, even he comes in as like, I can try to be of help here.
He puts the 10 sign with Kugisaki in that moment.
It's comparing them to that same sort of dynamic that we got a glimpse of in Hidden Inventory arc. And then I think that also acts as like a sort of foreshadowing of what's going to happen over the course of the Shibuya arc and whatever's coming next. Because in the same way that sort of innocence and naivete didn't last for Geto, Shoko, and Gojo, it's not going to last for them either.
Yeah.
And in that same episode, we get Mekamaru. And his whole thing is essentially he's trying to get a chance at that sort of like innocent, young, childlike experience that he's been robbed of. And in the same way that it didn't work out for Geto, Shoko, and Gojo, it doesn't work out for Mekamaru either. The last thing he says before Mahito takes him out is, I'm going to see my friends, or I'll see my friends. And we know that's not true.
Yeah.
While we're seeing Yuji, Megami, and Nobara have that experience, we're seeing Mekamaru not have it and then fail in trying to get it.
Yeah.
And in the same way that like we've seen these two examples of how either you lose that innocence and that naivete, or you never get to have it because it doesn't work out, we know that in the future, that's what's going to happen to Nobara Yuji and Megami, that they're going to be robbed of that childlike innocence, that youthful joy they're getting to just a little glimpse of right now.
Yeah. The more I'm watching, the more I fall in love with Nobara's character. And it's sad that we don't get a lot from her, but I noticed a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning. I don't think Nobara gets enough credit for how important of a character she is. Just a couple of things I just want to mention. In season 1, she actually does a Black Flash with Yuji in the final battle at the end of season 1. That is extremely impressive for someone to do. And she was nominated to move up to grade 1. She just didn't get a chance to finish things because of what happened with Mahito. But if circumstances had gone a different way, she would have been granted that, especially with the fact that she technically has the ability to take Mahito out, which we thought only Yuji had the capability of doing that. Mahito calls Yuji his only mortal enemy, and he is furious when he realizes that there's someone else there.
Oh, he does say that in that fight with her. He says, oh, he's not my only normal enemy.
Exactly. So that, I think, has to be stated. When it comes to her qualifications, we stamp on that, because she's about that business for real. Second thing, she breaks a lot of tropes that, as we continue to consume more anime, I'm realizing how often Gege wrote her character as a way to break a lot of those stereotypes and tropes, and also poke fun at them in a lot of instances. When we first get introduced to her, she literally says, yeah, I'm the girl of the group. Right. So you're making it known to them and to us as an audience that, like, that's normally how a trio goes, not just in anime, but in shows in general. Star Wars is the same thing. You get two guy characters and one girl as well. Harry Potter is the exact same thing. Like, that's a common thing that happens in television. When she has her fight in the exchange event against Momo says something like, even if a girl is skilled, she's looked down upon because she's not cute. And then she then also says, of course, if she's only cute and not skilled, it's the same. Right. And I thought of, like, so many female characters that go through that conversation when they're introduced in any form of fashion of being lifted to the main character status. I remember listen, I'm not like the hugest fan of the first Captain Marvel film. But obviously it made $1 billion, so clearly it connected with a lot of people. But nonetheless, people were literally criticizing Brie Larson, not because of the fact that she was too powerful, but because she didn't smile enough in her interviews and for these pictures, which I thought was, like, insane. I don't think people often realize how it places women in that box of how they can sort of be represented. Nobara sort of responds to this sort of dichotomy that women are sort of placed in, and Momo acknowledges that it's not a good thing, but she's just sort of accepted it as a reality. And Nobara's like, bro, F that. Like, if I'm going to be pretty, I'm going to be pretty. If I'm going to be strong, I'm going to do both.
I was thinking about Nanami's story as a critique on capitalism, and how especially like when we talked about him, the episode when he died, you compared it to Meme, and I think the point becomes even stronger when you contrast it with Meme, because he is somebody who, like, played by his morals like his whole life. Like, and when he felt like he wasn't playing by his morals and he was like, I'm working this job, I don't like it, he quit and he went back to what he felt was the right thing and how he could use his strength to help other people and protect other people. Mm-hmm. He's not rewarded for that in the end, right? Like, that exact attitude is what costs him his life. Versus with Meme, she is a person who plays by the rules of capitalism. Like, she is like, I'm going where the money is at. I'm going to do what is profitable for me, and that's how I'm going to live my life. And in the end, she's sort of rewarded for that. She escapes to Malaysia, like you were pointing out, is where Nanami also wanted to go and didn't get to go, and lives. And it sort of reminds me of the way that capitalism rewards bad behavior. Like, people who take advantage of the most people, the people who are the most corrupt are often the people who are the most rewarded within the system of capitalism, and the people who try to fight against that and to live right are often people who pay the consequences in the end. I don't know, I appreciated his arc a lot the second time through.
A lot of Nanami's story really explores the themes of regret in a number of ways. Like, I think he regrets with how things went down with Haibara. What made this even more tragic and why his character is so connected to Yuji is he has an internal thought where he asks, why did I become a sorcerer again? Right? Like there is a sense of regret. Like I could have avoided all of this, played by the capitalistic rules like Mei does, and live a very simple life and retire in Malaysia. The moment he starts to regret this calling, Haibara shows up and he points to Yuji, right? And I think that that's very important because I think in that moment, this is Nanami realizing that Yuji is a future that he can place this on with no regrets. When Haibara sort of shows up in that moment, like you sort of mentioned, he is sort of reluctant to place that on him. And I sort of see that as, when he says it'll just be a curse on him. And I think he's realizing, I don't want Yuji to have to experience what I'm experiencing right now. But then I also see the fact that he's smiling when he says you'll take it from here. And to me, that made me feel like he came to the realization that all of the adventures that him and Yuji had gone on in these past 2 seasons, I think in that moment, he realizes through almost Haibara's blessing that Yuji can handle this. And this fight, this sort of relentless, which you sort of see portrayed in the fact that he was unwavering in destroying all of those curses before Mahito shows up, is so in line with who his character is. Like he's going to keep going and going and going, even if he does not enjoy what this fight is requiring of him. And there are a lot of moments in season 1 where he finds himself impressed not just with Yuji's ability, but Yuji's ability and his relentless to keep his empathy intact. And when he comes to that realization that this is a burden that I can place on this person because of those 2 things, he says with a smile, you take it from here.
Later on, Yuji, and it feels like to me like a response to Nanami's last words, but later on, Yuji says, I'll make sure I take on your share of suffering too, Nanami.
Woo, that's goosebumps right there, man. Last thing that I was going to sort of touch on is with Shoko. I know some of the people in our conversation pointed this out because she is sort of a part of that trio. And I feel like people haven't talked enough about how alone Shoko is now, right? Like essentially everyone in her class year is gone. There's that line where Principal Yaga, which I have to admit, he's probably feeling this as well, because he's like, these are all of the people that I taught. And so I'm wondering if he's also wrestling with this sense of failure. But he asks Shoko that line of like, hey, I thought you quit smoking. And then she says, I've been reminiscing about high school. And I feel like that's such a sad way, but the line hits so hard of like, yo, wait, she's the only one left. You've got to feel for her because they do such a good job of showing how much those moments are cherished by them. I mean, even the lyrics to the end credits during the hidden inventory arc, they sort of point to this idea of like, yeah, we've sort of gone our separate ways, but those fond memories fill them all with like a sense of regret. All right, y'all. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And with that, we will see you all next time. Peace out, everyone.